Ciaphas Cain says he only pretends to care about his soldiers, so they won't shoot him in the back. And yet this man knows pretty much every single one of them by name. That single sentence has been rattling around the Warhammer 40,000 community for years, accumulating silent agreements, because everyone who has read the Cain Archive already feels the contradiction lodged in it. They just haven't had anyone lay the evidence out in sequence and make the formal argument. That's what this is. We're putting Cain's own memoirs on trial today, using his own words as the prosecution's case file. And by the end, you'll see that a man who spent roughly a century writing private justifications for his cowardice accidentally produced one of the most thorough confessions of genuine heroism in the entire setting. Sandy Mitchell said it plainly in a 2018 interview with Track of Words. He was a huge fan of George MacDonald Fraser's Flashman books and had wanted to do something similar, a self-serving rogue that everyone else thinks is a hero, transplanted from Victorian history into a science fiction setting. That's the stated template. Harry Flashman, for anyone who hasn't read Fraser's novels, is a genuine coward, not a reluctant hero, not someone with hidden virtue he's too modest to acknowledge. He flees danger whenever he possibly can. His reputation is built entirely on accidents and misunderstood circumstances, and he has no real loyalty to anyone. When Flashman can act like a coward with impunity, he invariably does. Misogynistic, racist, a cowardly elitist, those qualities aren't shadows over a better man. They are the whole man. That's the archetype, and it's a compelling one, which is exactly why the Flashman in Space reading of Cain has persisted across 2 decades of fandom discussion. The problem is that reading was always wrong, and the text proves it. A discussion on the Malazan Empire forum put it with quiet precision. As such, Cain isn't quite as cowardly and blustering as either Blackadder or Flashman, and is a reasonably effective soldier. This is a good thing. That assessment has since been cited in academic analysis of the series, and it identifies the exact point where Mitchell departed from his own stated template. Flashman has no competence. Cain does. Flashman has no loyalty. Cain's archive is full of it, bleeding through even his most carefully constructed self-deprecation. The Flashman in Space label isn't an insight. It's a category error the novels spend roughly 12 books systematically disproving, one incident at a time. So, the exhibits. Exhibit A is from 931.m41, the opening pages of For the Emperor, the first novel in the series. After the defense of Kyrenia, 2 Valhallan regiments, the all-female 296th and the all-male 301st, had been gutted by Tyrannid assaults. High Command's solution was to merge the survivors into a single combined unit, the Valhallan 597th Ice Warriors, under Colonel Regina Castine, who had been acting CO of the 296th, and Major Rupert Broclaw, who had been acting CO of the 301st. An administrative decision made with no consideration for the human reality underneath it, which was that 2 proud, battered, grieving units, distinguished by gender, different in culture, each one carrying the dead weight of a different campaign's losses, had been forced into the same barracks and told to be one regiment. They weren't one regiment. They were 2 hostile factions sharing a mess hall, and the violence that followed was predictable to everyone except, apparently, High Command. The resulting brawl required High Command to dispatch a commissar to prevent full mutiny. That commissar was Cain. A genuine Flashman, handed this assignment, would have done exactly what the self-interested political calculation demanded. Let the regiment tear itself apart, report the casualties upward, and move on to a posting with better survival odds. That is the coward's move, and it's also the institutionally defensible one. Commissars are political officers, not mediators. No one would have blamed him for walking away from someone else's mess. Cain walked into it instead. He used charisma and cunning to avoid actually having to shoot anyone, and he succeeded. The 597th was formed. Cain earned their genuine respect. None of this was forced on him. He chose to step into active violence he had every legitimate reason to avoid. A self-serving coward reports casualties and requests reassignment. What Cain did was walk toward the shouting. That choice, at the very beginning of the archive, is the prosecution's cleanest piece of evidence, because it carries no possible alternative interpretation. Cain didn't stumble into the canteen brawl. No one tripped him down a flight of stairs into a room full of armed, grieving soldiers from two different regiments who wanted each other dead. He went in on purpose, with no strategic upside beyond the regiment surviving, and he made it work. A man genuinely motivated only by self-preservation would have done the math and walked the other direction. Whatever calculation Cain was actually running in his head, it wasn't the one he spent the rest of his life claiming to have made. Exhibit B requires a longer view. Across the roughly 12 novels in the Cain Archive series, covering documented major campaigns from 931 M41 to 999 M41, 68 standard years of active service, Cain encountered at least 8 confirmed distinct enemy factions. Hrude on Skekwi, Orcs on Castafor, Tyranids, Assyriani raiders, the Tau on Gravelax, where he was already navigating a conspiracy designed to start a full-scale war between two galactic powers, Chaos Forces, Necrons, and the Drukhari, specifically a Drukhari succubus, which is the kind of opponent that doesn't leave witnesses as a matter of professional pride. He faced all of them across 6 decades of active service, and he walked away every time. Then, at over 200 Terran years old, he was recalled during Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade. Because at 200 years old, Ciaphas Cain was apparently still the man the Imperium needed on a battlefield. The detail that keeps the community talking isn't the raw enemy list, it's the pattern of where these encounters happen. Down the stairs, through the tunnels, into the dark. The Necrons don't meet Cain in a briefing room. The Tyranid elements don't ambush him on the parade ground. There is a recurring structural logic to the archive, in which danger lives underground, and Cain is somehow always the person who ends up finding it. The community has developed a shorthand for this, unverified at the primary source level, so consider it collective wit rather than a confirmed quote. But it has circulated widely enough to become a shared joke, that page 1 of Amberley's commissarial playbook should just read, "Send Cain down the stairs." Because wherever there are stairs, there are tunnels. Wherever there are tunnels, there are Necrons, or Tyranids, or something considerably worse. And Cain always comes back up. The cowardice defense requires luck as its operative mechanism. He didn't choose danger, he stumbled into it, and luck carried him through. That explanation works once. It works a handful of times. After 68 documented years spanning at least 8 enemy factions and roughly 12 novels worth of underground encounters, luck stops being an explanation and starts being a description of something else entirely. Of a man whose instincts, experience, and accumulated competence had grown into something the archive's self-deprecating prose couldn't quite bury, no matter how many careful disclaimers Cain layered over it. Probability doesn't care about self-image. A century of survival against the galaxy's most lethal things isn't a lucky streak. It's a skill set Cain spent his entire literary life refusing to name. Exhibit C is a single moment in The Traitor's Hand, the 3rd novel, and it's the most personally revealing of the 5. Commissar Tomas Bage insulted Colonel Castine in her absence. Cain's response was to challenge Bage to a duel. His exact words, preserved in the archive. "You can accuse me of anything you like, but you won't disparage Colonel Castine in my presence. She's one of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to serve with, and the regiment she leads is among the best in the galaxy." This shouldn't have happened. A detached political officer, which is what a commissar is by institutional design, does not challenge peers to duels over regimental honor. Commissars are attached to regiments, not of them. They are the Imperium's instrument within the Guard, not the guard's instrument against the Imperium's other officers. Beige was a fellow commissar, which meant challenging him carried genuine political and physical risk. There was no strategic benefit. There was no calculation that made this the smart play for a self-interested survivor who constantly claims to be thinking 3 moves ahead. What there was, instead, was a man who had spent years with the 597th and had quietly stopped being an outsider attached to them. He had become one of them. He'd been one of them since 931 M41, since the Canteen Brawl and the regiment's early campaigns, and somewhere in that time, Cain had shifted from the commanding officer I need to keep functional for my own survival to one of the finest soldiers I've ever served with. That isn't a performance. A coward performing loyalty doesn't throw it in a fellow commissar's face at personal risk, with no audience to impress. That's identity, and it's exactly what Cain's Archive, despite his best efforts to frame himself as permanently detached and calculating, keeps demonstrating on page after page. Notice what he doesn't say in that moment. He doesn't say he challenged Beige because it was tactically useful, or because he needed the 597th's cooperation for the next campaign, or because insulting the commanding officer of his regiment created command friction he couldn't afford. He says Cain is one of the finest soldiers he's ever served with, and the regiment is among the best in the galaxy. He says it with conviction, in front of a hostile audience, at personal risk. That's a man defending something he actually believes in. The archive, for once, has no careful disclaimer attached. Exhibit D is the most indirect, and because of that, the most structurally convincing. Janet Sulla served under Cain in the 597th. Her tactical signature throughout the series was aggressive offensive charges, reckless by most measures, the kind of forward momentum that gets junior officers court-martialed or decorated depending entirely on whether it works. Community analysis of the series notes that this success pattern baffled even Amberly Vale, who as editor of the archive had full access to the campaign records and still couldn't account for why Sulla's charges kept paying off when they had no business doing so. Cain's own memoirs treat Sulla with characteristic dismissiveness, which is itself telling. He notices her, he tracks her career across multiple novels, he comments on her tactical choices with the weary tone of a man who has had to deal with the consequences of those choices. A man genuinely indifferent to the soldiers around him doesn't maintain that level of running commentary on a subordinate officer's career trajectory. The implicit argument here is structural. Sulla's tactical aggression, forward-moving, apparently reckless, consistently effective, is the signature of someone who learned under a commander whose instincts pointed toward the threat rather than away from it. Cain would never have taught this deliberately. He would deny teaching it at all. But subordinates don't develop winning aggressive tactics in a vacuum, and the pattern holds across Sulla's career long after she left the 597th. Something in Cain's command radiated outward into the people around him, and the archive's studied indifference to Sulla is the exact shape of a man trying not to notice what he built. He influenced her without intending to, without claiming credit, without even fully acknowledging it happened. An unrecognized legacy is harder to fake than a recognized one. You can perform loyalty for an audience. You can't perform an influence that operates through your subordinates' instincts long after you've stopped paying attention. Exhibit E is the most speculative, and it needs to be labeled clearly as such. Readers of the novels, and this is a reader interpretation of the text rather than a point settled beyond all debate, have noted that Cain seems to experience a physical danger sense, a premonition that registers in his body, even when Jurgen is nearby. The significance of that detail lies in Jurgen's null field. His blank aura, the pariah gene, suppresses all warp phenomena within his proximity. Psychic abilities go quiet. Demonic manifestations lose coherence. The immaterium locally dims. If Cain carries any psychic sensitivity, Jurgen's presence should suppress it. The evidence doesn't definitively settle whether this danger sense is textually established or interpretively constructed, so it belongs in the category of compelling fan observation rather than hard canon. But if Cain's danger sense persists despite Jurgen standing beside him, then either the phenomenon isn't warp-based or it's 68 years of cultivated tactical instinct that no null field can switch off. Both possibilities point in the same direction, toward a man who has been paying extraordinarily careful attention to a lethal universe for a very long time and whose body started doing the accounting for him. Now the prosecution has to put its own case on the stand. The epistemological problem with everything above is real, and it deserves a direct confrontation rather than a footnote. Every single source in the Cain Archive is compromised. The memoirs themselves were written by a self-confessed habitual liar who, as academic analysis of the text has noted, described himself sometimes as a coward while his actions remained stubbornly heroic. That's your foundation document, unreliable by the narrator's own admission. Amberly Vail compiled and edited the archive with romantic investment in her subject. She selects which material to include, which footnotes to add, which framing to apply. Her editorial voice is woven through the text, and she isn't a neutral party. The troops of the 597th worshipped Cain. Their perspective, where it surfaces, is colored by hero worship built over decades. Jurgen's loyalty is described throughout the series as fanatical. You are looking at a document assembled by people who loved the man, filtered through the man's own sustained campaign of self-deprecation. One reading of all this, a reading some audience members will hold on to even after all 5 exhibits, is that Cain's self-deprecating persona is a deliberate performance, a carefully maintained literary pose designed to generate reader sympathy. And the whole cowardice framing is a storytelling device rather than a psychological truth. That reading isn't entirely wrong, it's just incomplete. Because if the cowardice is a pose, then Mitchell wrote a character who sustained that pose flawlessly across roughly 12 books, including in private memoir entries where Cain had no audience to perform for. The internal monologue of a man writing documents he expected to be sealed never cracks into genuine self-awareness, which is itself a remarkable thing to have written, though it shifts the credit from the character to the author without actually resolving the question of what Cain actually was. The epistemological problem can't be fully resolved. What it can be is overcome by cumulative weight. Across 68 documented years of service, across a career that began with a voluntary walk into a canteen brawl and included a duel challenge against a fellow commissar over regimental honor and ended with a recall at over 200 years old, the exhibits don't require any single source to be perfectly reliable. They just require cumulative implausibility. A genuine coward stumbles into danger once and gets lucky. A genuine coward does not, for a century, keep choosing the harder path when the easier one was available and institutionally defensible. At some point, the pattern is the man. Amberly Vail understood this, and her editorial choices are themselves part of the evidence. She is a romantically invested source, yes, but that investment gives her no motive to fabricate heroism Cain didn't perform. She would have every reason to shade the emotional framing, to soften the uglier episodes, to present the best version of the man she loved. What she wouldn't do is invent the canteen brawl, or the duel, or Sulla's career trajectory, or 68 years of underground encounters with at least 8 enemy factions. Those incidents are either there in the archive or they aren't. Amberly chose to include them. Every exhibit this prosecution has built comes from material she decided to publish. A romantically invested editor presenting a complicated man rather than writing hagiography. The fact that she published the evidence rather than suppressing it is itself an argument that the evidence was too fundamental to the portrait to remove. She was telling us something. She just let Cain's own words do most of the telling. Which brings us to Jurgen, and to a theory that needs to be introduced with full transparency. This is fan extrapolation, not established canon. A Reddit thread at r/40klore asking the question directly received the answer that it isn't canon that Cain is a living saint. It's popular headcanon/speculation. No primary source establishes this as settled lore, and no canonical precedent was found for a blank suppressing a living saint's ascension. Present the following as a thought experiment with plausible mechanics, not as a lore fact. A living saint in Warhammer 40,000. Celestine, being the most prominent example, is a soul recognized by the warp itself, a convergence of belief and divine attention that manifests as something genuinely supernatural. The process is warp-mediated. It requires the immaterium to notice a soul and respond to it. Jurgen's blank aura, generated by the pariah gene, suppresses warp phenomena within his proximity. He makes psychers nauseous. He causes demonic manifestations to lose coherence. The immaterium locally quiets around him wherever he stands. He has been standing at Cain's side for a career spanning decades. During that time, Cain accumulated a cult of personality, a reputation as hero of the Imperium, built from a century of documented service against at least 8 enemy factions, across campaigns that should have killed him repeatedly and didn't. If the conditions for living saint recognition had been assembling around Cain for all those years, Jurgen would have been standing right next to them, suppressing them, not maliciously, devotedly, fanatically, with complete and unswerving loyalty to the man he was protecting. The cruelest arrangement the 41st millennium has to offer might be that the person most dedicated to Cain's survival is also, by his very nature, the person whose presence ensured Cain would never receive the universe's formal acknowledgement of what he had become. 100 years of heroism, quietly canceled by the proximity of the one man who loved him most completely. Cain earned a century of recognition the warp could never deliver, because his best friend was standing too close. The evidence doesn't slam the gavel shut. Mitchell never gave an interview explaining that Cain is definitively a genuine hero and the cowardice is definitively false. The Flashman template is real. The author invoked it himself, and some of the departure from that template may have been organic rather than designed. Cain becoming more competent and more loyal than his model, not because Mitchell planned it, but because the character demanded it over roughly 12 books. A version of this story exists in which Cain is a sufficiently effective political survivor that his effectiveness looks like heroism from the outside, and the memoirs are a reasonably accurate self-portrait. That version is available. The evidence just doesn't support it as well as the alternative. The alternative, the verdict the prosecution submits while leaving that crack open for the cynics, is that Ciaphas Cain was a genuinely competent, genuinely loyal, genuinely brave man who developed, somewhere in 68 years of service, a psychological architecture that couldn't accommodate that self-image. That the cowardice framing was never quite a lie, but was never quite the whole truth either. That he walked into a canteen brawl he could have avoided, challenged a fellow commissar he had no tactical reason to confront, shaped an officer whose aggressive instincts mirrored his own without ever claiming the credit, and stumbled into at least 8 separate flavors of existential threat across 6 decades because something in him kept pointing toward the fight, even as the rest of him filled pages with careful explanations of why he hadn't meant to be there. The archive, written in retirement, intended as private justification, turned out to be a century-long confession he never noticed he was making. Every exhibit, every campaign, every name he remembered, all of it slipping past the self-deprecation like water past a closing hand. And the universe knew. Someone in the comments put it better than the prosecution can. One day, Ciaphas is going to wake up from whatever pastoral dream of an afterlife he's in, finding himself in the middle of a battlefield. That image lands hard because it's the precise shape of his entire life. The pastoral dream is what he wanted. Every quiet retirement, every comfortable posting between campaigns, every evening he spent writing careful disclaimers about not being the man people thought he was. The battlefield is what he kept ending up on, Not because the universe was cruel, but because the universe had read the same archive we have, and it wasn't confused about what it said. He spent a century running from a thing he already was. The memoirs were never a defense. Far from serving as a defense, they became 100 years of evidence he was too psychologically cornered to read clearly. And Amberly Vail, who loved him and knew exactly what she was doing, published every word of them anyway. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe.